This is Relationship Truth Unfiltered, a podcast that ditches destructive traditions and delves into real biblical teaching about relationships. Julie here with an episode I'm really excited about because we're tackling a question that keeps coming up in our community. Why do churches often resist or push back against abuse ministry? Leslie's back with us to share what she's learned from her years on the front lines of this work. So whether you felt dismissed by your church or you're trying to create change from within, this conversation is for you. Now, Leslie, you have been doing this work for a long time now. What is the kind of pushback that you typically get from pastors and Christian counselors?
Well, it's better now, Julie. But 50 years ago when I started this work, I was a fresh-faced new graduate from social work school, and I worked in a hospital. And my first job assignment was to work in the emergency room, teaching doctors and nurses how to recognize suspected child abuse in children when they came to the ER, because new laws had been passed, and we wanted to do our due diligence as professionals to make sure that we weren't calling something an accident that was really intentional. If it was a child who had a broken bone or a broken arm or a black eye, we wanted to know what to look for. As I was gaining skill in training these doctors and nurses and emergency room staff to know what to look for, I began to notice that in our churches, we didn't screen our childcare workers. And this came to me in crashing technicolor during a church service when our pastor asked for volunteers for a boys' sleepover that weekend that they were doing for a boys' brigade program. And he needed volunteers, men, to sleep in the tents with these little boys from the ages of 8 to 12 who were taking this little camping trip. And afterwards, I went up to him and I said, "You got 5 raised hands of men who are willing to work with the children this weekend in tents. How do you know these men? How do you know these men aren't pedophiles? How do you know that your children will be safe with them?" And he looked at me like I had just grown 2 horns. And he said, "Leslie, you're being ridiculous. These men are Christians. They're family men. They have their own children. They've been in our church for a while. I know them. They wouldn't possibly do anything like that." And so I think it was back then more of the naivety that Christians don't do that Christians walk to a higher standard. They would never do anything evil to children. And every church that I talked to throughout the late 70s and 80s, early 80s, when I moved from Michigan to Pennsylvania, same thing, bigger church, went to the church leadership. "Hey, you're not screening child? Oh, we don't need to do that." And so I think there was this resistance that, hey, we're not to judge. We're not to, have bad thoughts about our fellow Christians. Why would we assume the worst? We should just assume the best. And all of that makes perfect sense unless it's your kid who gets abused. And so what motivated the churches to change was not those of us who were beating the drum, hey, we need to make our, nurseries safer and our, children's programs safer, put doors, windows in the doors so we can see what's going on. That wasn't the motivation. The motivation, sadly, was financial. That when churches started getting sued, when the Catholic churches scandal started to come, open up and break open in the news, and, churches were sued when children were harmed or killed by a leader in the church or a priest, then the insurance companies began to say, wait a minute, we're not paying all these lawsuits unless you have a standard of care to screen your workers, to make sure that you did your due diligence and you're not just ignoring a problem that could have been prevented. And so that's what motivated churches to change their ways. And now every church has a protocol to screen workers. And that doesn't necessarily prevent all problems, but it gives parents a modicum of safety that a registered sex offender isn't working in the nursery, because that's checked. But it wasn't checked back then. And so I've always had a heart to protect and create safety for children, for adults. I was an abused child. I know what that feels like. I know what it feels like to grow up in it. It was my mom who did the abuse. But imagine if it was a pastor, a spiritual person who was your youth pastor, or someone who was instructed to care for your soul and also sexually or physically harmed you.
Terrible. That's probably the worst. I think there's another level of grossness when it would be a minister and somebody that represents or claims to represent God that would do that.
Yeah. And sadly, it's not that uncommon as we're seeing today. And it was always common. It just never was talked about or seen. Now it's much more seen and aware. And even now, churches are still a little naive. They have the protocol in place. But when someone actually discloses, it's harder for them to actually do it.
To actually believe, yeah. And how did you go then from trying to protect the children to taking a firm stance on women and their abuse, especially within the church?
I worked with my church in Pennsylvania with a child abuse protocol, and I attended a large church there. And so we did a lot of work with training all the childcare workers, training the pastoral staff. And that was really wonderful. But I was writing my book on depression in women, and I was counseling a lot of women who had a common theme. And the common theme was they were in emotionally destructive marriages. And I began to feel really burdened, like, wait a minute, is the best thing that we can offer these women is to take antidepressants for the rest of their life? I had a client who would drink, I don't know how much because I don't drink, but enough vodka so that she would be sort of out of it because her husband demanded sex every night and he was abusive to her, and she just was losing her mind, having to submit to his authority, to his harshness, to the harshness of the children. And she was becoming more and more depressed, and the way she coped was vodka, and came to counseling. And I'm thinking, is this the best we offer her as a Christian counselor? Is, hey, keep taking your antidepressant medication, and if you need a shot of vodka in order to be a good wife, that's what God would want for her? And God really began to speak to my heart that no, this isn't the answer. And so I began to advocate for women, then began to write my book, The Emotionally Destructive Relationship and The Emotionally Destructive Marriage, because I saw that the mental health issues that I was dealing with as a counselor often were stemming from difficult, destructive relationship problems.
So, when you're talking to church leaders, what is the hardest thing for them to grasp on this subject of destructive marriage and especially abused women?
Well, if we can go back just for a minute to the bigger picture, I think that Brad Hambrick actually, I think, did a study on this. He's a counselor in the Summit Church in North Carolina. So he did a survey with pastors about whether they had more empathy for a pastor or leader who might be falsely accused, or more empathy for the victim who was sharing the story of abuse. And he saw that naturally, as a pastor, you would have probably more affiliation and empathy for the fear of being falsely accused. And so I think that's one of the reasons why leaders have a hard time identifying with the victim, because they're so much fearing the other. Like, what if she's not telling the truth? What if she's lying about her pastor husband, that he's really not abusive? She just wants to get out of this marriage and she's falsely accusing him. I wouldn't want my wife to do that and ruin my ministry. And I remember being at a women's retreat not too long ago, probably 10 years ago, and a pastor in Texas was being accused of being sexually abusive to a woman in his youth group when he was a youth pastor there. And one of the women there attended that church and knew that pastor, and she had all the empathy for him. Hey, he's being falsely accused. She's ruining his ministry. That happened a long time ago. Why is she having to bring this up now? If it was really true, she would have told the truth back then. And so I think there's this, when you like someone and they're charming and you identify with them and they're your pastor and they're your
Yeah.
leader, or they're you don't want to be falsely accused. You don't want to lose everything you've worked so hard to build. And so I think that's one of the biggest reasons that I see pastors resisting dealing with this, because I don't want to be, I feel for them. I don't want to be on that end of being accused when I didn't do it. But those realities are so slight. Most victims are telling the truth. I don't know the exact number, but studies show that very few people issue a false report like that, because it's so humiliating to have to tell your story about being a victim,
Yes.
that most people do not do that.
I think, too, a lot of pastors don't believe that a husband can sexually abuse a wife, and that abuse is really only if he's hitting and leaving bruises and that type. That's what they typically think of when they think of abuse. And these other types of covert things are, well, her body is not her own. So there is no such thing as sexual abuse in marriage. How do you train them that that is not true?
Well, it was interesting because when I was teaching domestic violence classes at Westminster Seminary back when I lived in the Philadelphia area, I talked about that. I talked about sexual abuse. And I remember very clearly a gentleman in the MDiv program at Westminster Seminary raising his hand and challenging me, saying, "What are you talking about, sexual abuse? You can't have sexual abuse in a marriage. A wife can't say no." And this was
Wow.
not 20 years ago. I mean, this was 12 years ago. So there's still a mindset of a
There
very
is.
patriarchal mindset that your wife is your property and you can do what you want within. I mean, you can't beat her, but her body is not hers, it's yours. And she has no right to know. Submission removes that as soon as she says, "I do." And so that mindset is not all that uncommon. It's not common like it used to be, but it's still there. Just 12 years ago, when I spoke at this class, that was the response of one of the people. Now, others in the class were pretty aghast when he said that. So good for,
I'm
yeah, good for
glad.
the others, especially the females in the class. But he was convinced that he was right. And I didn't have time in that class to argue with him about his position because of our time.
I was going to ask, what would you say to him?
So what I would say to him is that that's not what Paul's talking about there. If anything in 1 Corinthians 7, where he's talking about the sexual responsibilities or duty of marriage, every woman in a patriarchal culture who Paul was writing to in that time knew her conjugal duties. She knew that, yeah, I need to have sex with my husband. That's part of the responsibilities of being a wife. The interesting thing that Paul is doing in a patriarchal culture, if you think about it, and he's writing to people who are actually asking a question on a different matter. They were saying, "Hey, if I'm going to be a really, really good Christian in this new world of Christianity here, do I have to abstain from sex? Because some people are telling us that we can't have sex, even if we're married. Is that true, Paul?" And Paul's saying, "No, if you're married, you can have all the sex you want." And then he's going into how that happens. And he says, "Hey, wives, your body is not your own, it's your husband's. And likewise," and that word likewise is a very important phrase because what it does is in a patriarchal culture where you have men over women, that likewise in the household duty codes kind of levels the playing field. It's not that she doesn't have any rights, she has the same rights as he does. Likewise, husbands, your body is not your own. And so for a husband to think that he has the rights to control her body, but she doesn't have the right to say, "Hey, I don't want your body on top of my body right now." She has the rights to control his body too. And so that's what's unique about that passage is Paul is leveling this patriarchal playing field in marriage where a woman is just property and just an object to use. That was not God's intention for marriage. That was not God's intention for a sexual relationship. And so Paul is teaching that in a way that in that culture they can hear that, hey, Jesus is doing things different. There is no difference between male, female, Jew, Gentile, slave, or free. In this hierarchical, patriarchal culture where people are being abused and oppressed, whether it's by the Romans or by males to females, we're not allowing that anymore. It's not okay.
And that would be your answer to the whole biblical headship argument as well?
No, I would say something different. I think there's different viewpoints on headship and submission, and this isn't a topic about, we're not talking about all that. But what I will say is that Jesus defined it really clearly. So headship is defined when he said to his disciples, "Hey guys, you're going to be the future leaders of our church." He said this in Matthew, he said this in Mark and Luke. "You're going to be the future leaders of our church. Do not do it like the Gentiles do, using power over." All right, so I'm going to give you power as leaders of the church. But the power is to be exercised power under. You lift others up, you serve them, power with, you empower together, you work together. You don't use your power over to oppress or suppress others. And so he was very clear what headship looked like. There is headship, there is leadership in the church, but not a power over model. And so when you look at headship and submission, if a male has typically more power, not only more physical power, but he also has more political power in that culture. He had more spiritual power in the Bible. He has more authority that way. He's not to use it to oppress or suppress. He's to use it to build up and love, which is what Paul says in the household duty codes in Colossians and in Ephesians. And so when we look at it in that context, it makes perfect sense. And submission is not just for women. or wives. We're to submit to authority, we're to submit to one another, and we're to submit to God. All believers are to learn the discipline of submission. And what the discipline of submission teaches you is that you don't have to get your way all the time in order to be happy. You can give in, you can compromise, you can go along for the greater good. And so, yes, wives are taught to submit, but submission is a choice. And so when you're not given a choice, you're ordered, you're oppressed, you're bullied, you're coerced, you're threatened into submission by a bully leader. Well, that's not biblical headship, and that's not biblical submission. It's called oppression, coercion, and it's called, you know, giving in because you're afraid, not because you're choosing to submit. Very different terms.
So, Leslie, it just doesn't seem that hard to grasp. And yet, our church leaders, in general, there's a lot of church leaders that don't. What is the hardest thing for them to grasp about these teachings?
Again, when I've talked to pastors, I remember a pastor, I was speaking at a conference in Virginia, and he contacted me through email. He said, I'm thinking of inviting you to my church, but I'm afraid that you're going to break up all of our marriages. And so I really want to interview you ahead of time. I thought it was pretty honest. I want to interview ahead of time. So will you be willing to meet with me at McDonald's? And I want to just talk to you before I invite you to my church.
McDonald's, really?
Yeah,
That's the best
yeah.
he could do.
So we had, lunch at McDonald's or coffee or whatever we did. It was a good place in between. And, I think he was a good man. He was a good pastor of a large church, but his fear was, if we talk about this honestly, that so many women in his church are going to say, that's me, that they won't have the bandwidth to handle it. And that so many people will be starting to say, I'm getting divorced, I'm not living like this. And that would dishonor God, because just like institutions, when we think about the whole child abuse scandal, institutions valued they'll call it the protection of the church. But what they really were valuing is protection of the status quo, because they didn't want to tell the truth that their leaders were scoundrels and abusers. And what changed that was the financial implications of that. I think in the same way, we have elevated the sanctity of marriage to a place that God didn't elevate it to. Yes, I want to support the sanctity of marriage. I'll be married 50 years this year. So it's the same person. So I believe in the sanctity of marriage. I don't believe in quick and easy divorce for no reason. But I don't think that God elevated the sanctity of marriage any more than he elevated the institution of the church above the safety and the sanity of the people in it. So I think the churches have gotten afraid to deal with this issue because it is going to disrupt the way marriages are in many families.
Do you wonder whether your marriage is just difficult or if it's actually destructive? Leslie has a quick start guide that will answer that very question. Not only that, if you find your marriage is in the destructive category, this guide will give you concrete biblical answers on your next steps. Go to leslievernick.com/start to get your free quick start guide and start a personal growth journey that will impact all of your relationships. There's a lot on the internet, Leslie, that you are pro-divorce and that you undermine marriage. How do you respond to those criticisms?
I don't respond to them, because if someone has an honest confusion or curiosity about where I stand, I'm happy to interact with them. But Jesus was criticized, and I'm not Jesus for sure. I could be wrong. And I have people who can speak into my life if they think that I'm going off the deep end in a wrong way, and I listen to them. But I think that there are people who criticize me because they don't want to look at themselves. They don't want to really look at, what does a healthy relationship look like? What does a healthy marriage look like? What does a healthy sinner look like? So when I'm teaching pastors and they'll say to me, well, Leslie, you're so, everybody sins. What if I, lose my temper and say the bad thing to my wife? Or what if I,
Right.
have a slip up and, have an affair? Does that mean I'm an abusive husband? No, it doesn't necessarily mean you're an abusive husband. I had a slip up as a parent and I abused my child. I talk about that story a lot. And so an abusive incident that you have with someone doesn't make you a candidate for divorce or an abusive person necessarily. Now, if you hold a gun to someone's head for the first time, it might be that she's not going to ever want to live with you again. So an abusive incident can be very serious and very lethal. But if you're engaged in an abusive incident where you've told a terrible lie, you've committed adultery, you've demeaned and diminished the dignity and value of someone in your household, a healthy sinner owns it. They say, oh my gosh, look what I did, not look what you made me do. Look what I did. This isn't who I want to be. This isn't how I want to show up, even when I'm angry. I am so sorry, and I am never going to do this again. Whatever I have to do, whether I have to cut my tongue out or pull my eye out or go to counseling or get help or whatever I have to do to not do that again, I am committed to working on that. That's what a healthy sinner does. That's what repentance is.
I think I've told the story before, when I first came across your book and didn't know who you were, and I took the quiz in the front of the emotionally destructive marriage, and I scored it, and I felt this kind of, because it showed that I was in a destructive marriage, and I remember this kind of like, I knew it. I knew what a victim I was. And the Lord spoke very clearly, okay, now take it again, but answer the way your husband would. And I was like, oh, shoot. And when I scored it, he was in a worse marriage than I was. And I tell you, I can remember that night like it happened yesterday, because it absolutely broke my heart. And I had to recognize and admit that in my trying to change him and trying to get him to see, I had become incredibly destructive. And I got on my knees in a very real way and repented, because I didn't want to ever be like that again. And things changed from that moment on. But I think you're right. That is the correct response, is true repentance.
Right. And I love that you tell that story, Julie, and that you're honest with it, because I think there's a lot of organizations out there who are getting into the abuse ministry that treat victims as if they have no work to do.
Right.
Like it's all him, it's all him, it's all him. And he might have a boatload of stuff. He might be
Oh, he did.
yeah, a terribly wicked, evil person. But what does that do to you, and how is it shaping you? And that was really God saying, hey, Julie, you can't fix him, but let's look at you and how this is impacting you, because you're getting deformed by this. And see, a healthy sinner recognizes that. A healthy sinner says, whoa, this person is impacting me in a negative way, like the woman who was taking vodka and stuffing antidepressant pills because her marriage was impacting her, and her coping strategies were also hurting her. And so this is part of what we do. And if that means a woman needs to separate in order to get herself clear and healthy and safe enough to be able to do her work before
Yeah.
she can ever start to repair the marriage, then maybe that's what she does. And so I think sometimes I get accused of breaking up marriages, but this is what I do. I do a little math. So unhealthy, toxic husband, an unhealthy, toxic victim, you cannot fix that into a healthy marriage for the kiddos who are watching.
Right.
And so I believe that all children deserve one healthy parent. And so if you have unhealthy, toxic perpetrator, abuser, and an unhealthy, becoming toxic victim, then if the unhealthy, toxic victim starts to work on herself like you did,
Mm-hmm.
then maybe she can stop being unhealthy to her littles around her,
Yes.
and she can start being an example of a strong, godly woman to this toxic man. Now, he may hate that and be worse and, really clarify, I'm in danger and I need to get out of this
Right.
marriage. Or he may say, wow, she's doing things different. Maybe I can do things different too. And we can begin to start building some healthy patterns. Now, no guarantees, but I think that that is the only chance, because if you have unhealthy and unhealthy, you don't create a healthy, strong marriage. So if I'm working with pastors or counselors, I'll say to them, hey, we don't start with marriage work. We start with individual work.
Yeah, that's another thing people don't like about you, is that you recommend against couples counseling, and they think, how could you possibly not recommend couples counseling? And this is why.
Right, because unhealthy and unhealthy don't create healthy. Right.
Right.
So unhealthy and healthy if you start to get healthier, you're still going to be a sinner, but a healthy sinner, then you have the opportunity to respond to this unhealthy person in a different way, still with good boundaries, with firm no, all the things that you need to do, but you're not as toxic as you were by retaliating or placating or fawning and people pleasing and all of that kind of stuff. We have this idea in Christianity that the woman is to be the heroic sacrificer to keep the marriage together at all costs, at any price, even if it costs her her health, her children, and sometimes her life. And I don't believe that's what the Bible teaches. I don't think the Bible teaches, and this is Lisa Turker's paraphrase, but she says, I don't believe that God calls us to give up the best of who we are in order to enable the worst in someone else to flourish. Our job as wives to love our husbands into their best self, not to love our husbands and let them be whoever they want to be and harm us. That's not love. Love does good to someone, doesn't allow harm to be done to them if they can help it. Going back to the church and leadership, I think, again, if we think about it in a positive way, I think systemically we're not doing a great job as churches in really teaching what healthy looks like, teaching what maturity looks like, teaching what healthy relationships look like. Some churches are doing much better these days than previously, but we're still not doing a great job. And so I think we grow up with false notions of what marriage is supposed to be. I'm going to find my Prince Charming. I'm going to, be happy ever after. I'm going to live in this dream house. And I remember Beth Moore writing in one of her books, she said, I woke up and I realized I'm not Barbie, he's not Ken, and this is no dream house. And marriage is marriage is hard. Marriage is hard work. And if you're not prepared for that and you don't know how to deal with that, and you've been given false notions of what it means to be masculine or feminine, or false notions of what it means to be a head and be a leader, or false notions of what it means to be submissive. And that's causing more toxicity and unhealthiness in your marriage. And I think it's important to sometimes have a course correction and say, hey, we've gotten this wrong. Hey, we haven't done our due diligence, or we're living in a different culture where we need to be more mindful. Even, 100 years ago, slavery was fine in the church. It's not fine. Racial division was fine in the church. It's not fine. And so as we're growing and learning and becoming more aware, the way that we have subjugated women and put them as second-class citizens, they're very useful as long as they know their place in a lot of churches. I think that's hurt the body of Christ, and I think it's hurt marriages. And I think we are having some course correction happening in the church, and I hope that it continues to happen. And sometimes some people may feel it's overkill, and maybe so for a bit, until we are able to rebalance things so that they're really functioning in love. And I think one of the things that I think I've been really focused on, Julie, for me and my ministry and in our relationships, is that the most important thing to God isn't truth. Like, this is what the Bible says, and this is how you have to do. That's not the truth. That's not the most important thing. The most important thing is love. And I'm not saying wishy-washy, love everybody and ignore the truth. I'm saying that when push comes to shove, speaking the truth in love is loving. But demanding your own way and punishing other people who don't agree is not loving, right? And so if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not love, it's just noise. And God tells us that. And so I think we have to be careful how we say things, but we do need to say things. And so it's both and we need to learn as a church to be able to do that and to listen to different people's opinions instead of just having one authority guru who knows all truth. There is no guru who knows all truth other than Jesus.
So I'm going to give you that chance now, Leslie. Say something to the pastor who's been brave enough to listen and is still listening. What would you want to say to him on this topic?
If you've listened to this whole podcast, good for you. I'm really proud of you, because you're open to learning new things and you're open to feedback. And if we think about a healthy person, that's how you grow. If you're an athlete, I don't even know the names of any athletes, but if you're, Simone Biles on the gymnastics, that's probably the only name I would know.
Patrick Mahomes.
Patrick Mahomes, yeah. If you're not listening to your coach, if you're not watching the replays, about what you did good and what you did wrong, you're not growing. You're not growing because feedback and listening to others outside of us, all of us look in the mirror every day for feedback. Do I have makeup under my eyes? Is my hair sticking up? Do I need a shave? All that feedback helps us present ourselves in the best possible way. And so, if you're listening to this as a pastor and you're getting some feedback about what you could do better in terms of listening to victims, listening to stories, giving credibility to a female voice, and saying, this hurts, this isn't okay. I don't want to be treated this way. And maybe it's hard because you recognize, I've had pastors say this to me, I treat my wife the same way. And I didn't realize it was abusive. I didn't realize that that was inappropriate. I just thought that was being the leader. And so I think sometimes seeing the truth about ourselves, like if you look in the mirror and you realize you just preached a whole sermon with a booger coming out of your nose, it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing. It's humiliating. But if we don't look at it and fix it and change it, then we're not going to be able to grow. And so if you're a pastor listening to this, or you're a church leader, even a counselor, and you're beginning to see, wow, maybe I've pushed people into marriage counseling, but they've both been so unhealthy and toxic, it didn't really go well, because it can't go well if you can't listen, if you can't hear feedback, if you can't work on yourself, if it's always about the other person, then you won't be able to change and grow.
If a pastor wants to learn more, where do they go? Where do they find the resources to be educated on these types of abuse and do better by not just the women, but the men in their church as well, by calling them to a higher standard?
So there's many programs now. The Church Cares curriculum is free. It's out there, churchcares.com. You can also go to the American Association of Christian Counselors, and I have a whole 3-hour video curriculum that you can watch on, being a church that handles abuse well. Probably the easiest way, I think, though, is to go to my website and join our Equip group. Chris Moles is a pastor, and we lead a group for counselors and coaches and pastors who want to learn more about this. And we meet monthly so that it's kind of a slow learn. There's a whole video library that you can watch at your leisure, but every month we get together for 90 minutes and we discuss issues. We discuss what's happening in the news. We discuss what's happening in the church. We discuss what's happening in your cases so that you have that accountability. You have that peer support. We have a Facebook page that if you're in a crisis and you need some extra help, people are there for you. And I think that's really hard in leadership, for people to feel safe, to have a group to say, hey, I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm messing up. Help, help. And that's a group that leaders and pastors and counselors can go to and get the support from myself and a pastor who's a counselor, who's an expert in working with men in abusive relationships. We work together with the church to help them learn these things.
That's fantastic. I'm going to link those things in our show notes. And I really, really challenge you, if you're listening, maybe take this episode to your pastor and some of these show notes and these resources, because I believe that there are pastors out there that want to do the best by their marriages in their church. If you could wave a magic wand, Leslie, and just have one thing change in the church on this topic, what would it be?
Wow, that's a big, big one thing.
I know.
So this is what I would say. Take the pressure off yourself. If you're the leader, if you're the pastor, if you're the coach, if you're the counselor in the church, whatever, take the pressure off to fix their life. That's not your job to fix their life. And instead, just listen with compassionate curiosity to what's really going on. Ask good questions. And if you, by asking those good questions, feel like you're in over your head, like you don't know what to do, then just be honest and say, wow, I really care about you. I really care about you as a couple. This is way over my head. And we need to get an expert to help you if you're willing. Because I think so often we get this pressure like, oh my gosh, we've got to fix their marriage. We've got to solve their problem. We've got to do something. And so then we come in with solutions that are either inappropriate for the moment or too soon. They're not ready. And then we have another treatment failure, or they don't come back, or they try and say it didn't work. We've had women in our Conquer membership who have been to 15 different counselors over the years and nothing's helped, because sometimes the marriage counseling is not appropriate at this time. And it's better to be honest and say, I don't think your marriage is quite ready for you to work on until each of you do some individual work to get healthier. And that's sometimes the most honest thing that you can say. But listen with compassionate curiosity instead of feeling like you've got to be the go-to answer person. And I think that could really take the pressure off.
Let's pray for our church leaders, please, and these churches, that they would do better and be motivated to think about this topic.
Lord, you are a God of relationships. You have a relationship within the Trinity. You show us how important relationships are throughout the Old Testament. You create structure and laws as community comes about when an ox gets out of its cage or out of its fence and hurts someone, a neighbor. You say, hey, we don't just ignore that. We care about that. We make restitution. And Lord, you care about relationships. Every single one of the 10 commandments are about relationships with you or with one another. Lord, help us to be a church that cares about the quality of our relationships. I pray for the pastors, the church leaders, the marriage mentors, the counselors, the coaches that might be listening to this podcast, that they would care not just about keeping relationships together at all costs or using authority or power over to dictate to people what they have to do. That doesn't make for good relationships. That's an oppressive kind of regime that doesn't create relationships. But Father, I pray that you would help them listen to your heart for community, for companionship, for safety, for love. And those things don't happen by bullying and domineering and lying and cheating and oppressing. And so when that happens in relationships, things are damaged. Pray that you would help the leaders to listen to those who've been damaged, those who've been harmed, even if it's by them, with an open heart instead of defensiveness. That they would see that you're about restoration and not just cheap forgiveness, let's get over it, but true restoration and healing and growth. Because when we mess up, we can learn from that and we can grow from that only if we're willing to learn. So I pray for those who are listening that they would be willing. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you for listening to Relationship Truth Unfiltered. If you need clarity on whether your marriage is difficult, disappointing, or destructive, go to leslievernick.com/start. It is totally private and will help you get clear on your next step. Until next time, may God bless all of your relationships with Him, with yourself, and with others.